With 2 weeks to go until the election, CBC's poll tracker shows a steady lead for the Liberals nationally and widening margins in battleground Ontario, which has 122 seats up for grabs. The Liberals are leading the polls in the province with 49.2% support, while the Conservatives are 10 points back at 38.4%. The NDP all the way down to 8.1%, and the Greens at just 2.2%. My next panel of guests have been following the race closely in Ontario. Rob Benzie is the Queen's Park Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. Sabrina Nanji is the founder of the Queen's Park Observer. And Laura Stone is a reporter for the Globe and Mail's Queen's Park Bureau. Gang, good to see you all. It's good to have you here. Laura, let's start with you. The polls suggest 6-point Liberal lead nationally, marginally tighter than previous weeks, but still a double-digit gap in Ontario. How do you see the biggest province going with the debate coming up this week? Where do things stand?
Well, I think that the debate stakes are extremely high, right? Because the battleground, particularly in the Greater Toronto Area, is key to whoever forms government. And we've seen in the past several elections, the Conservatives have been unable to break through in the Greater Toronto Area, in the suburbs of Toronto, where I live. It's Karina Gould's riding, a Liberal, former Liberal cabinet minister. This is someone who a couple months ago was dead in the water when Justin Trudeau was leader, right? Everyone was anticipating that Karina Gould would not be able to win her riding, similarly to other MPs in the Greater Toronto Area. Now they've seen new life, and we've seen somewhat of a resurgence under Mark Carney's Liberals. So these issues of, affordability, housing prices, crime, these are all big deals in these areas, but are Trump's tariffs trumping this and leading to another Liberal sweep? And so I think that's why the debate and how Mr. Carney and Mr. Poilievre engage with each other, defend each other, make their pitches to Ontario voters will be extremely important this week.
So, Sabrina, I'm wondering, with what was said at the White House podium today, what Donald Trump has been saying, are Donald Trump and Doug Ford working together to put the boots to Pierre Poilievre? Because it seems like they keep finding ways to interject into this campaign in a way that doesn't help the Conservatives.
Yeah, and we saw kind of the opposite happen provincially, right? Like every time Donald Trump was in the headlines, that really worked for Doug Ford during the provincial campaign. We heard him talk about Trump, tariffs, even today with the throne speech, setting the tone for the next 4 years. It's going to be all about this economic uncertainty. And to Laura's point, that is top of mind for a lot of people in the province right now. And the more that is front and center, I think the harder it's going to be for Pierre Poilievre to break through in some of those key areas, like Laura mentioned, the 905. I'm also thinking of beyond the outskirts of the GTA, but it's virtually impossible to form a government federally without dominating in Ontario. You said there's 122 seats up for grabs. That's a big chunk of them, and so I do think that we might see the campaigns matter, the debate change some minds, and there's still some time to change tact here. But yeah, I think they've really got to make up the ground here. And I think, highlighting some of their stronger candidates who could be potential cabinet ministers down the line is key here. You've got Melissa Lantsman in Thornhill, Karen Stintz, Eglinton Lawrence. I think sort of showcasing the candidates is going to be should be part of the strategy too.
Okay, look, I want to talk a little bit about the fracture in Ontario with the Conservatives. And Benzie, you were here last time we played this clip. This is Doug Ford being asked about the frequent criticism that Corey Tenike, his campaign manager, has launched against essentially Jenny Byrne, who is Pierre Poilievre's campaign manager, on the podcast Curse of Politics and at other places. Here's what the Premier said yesterday.
He's tough as nails, but he's the best campaign manager in the country. And to be very frank, if Corey was running that campaign, I don't think Mr. Poilievre would be in the position he's in right now. But it's still a lot of time left, and we still have debates. At the end of the day, the people will decide which way they want this country to move forward. But sometimes the truth hurts.
Benzie, since that, all of these allegations, Doug Ford's not a real Conservative. We've seen Conservatives who are close to Byrne posting the private phone numbers and emails of members of the Ontario Conservative Party, encouraging people to basically voice their displeasure. This is not a good thing for them this close to voting day.
No, it's not a good thing for them this close to voting day. And David, Mr. Ford he is a conservative. He's the most powerful elected conservative in the country, but he's a progressive conservative, not necessarily a federal conservative. He's more of a centrist, and frankly, he spent the last 5 or 6 years working really closely with the federal Liberal government, first of Justin Trudeau, and now with Mark Carney. Chrystia Freeland, he counts as a personal friend. You remember when we did the story, David, of the first phone call that Pierre Poilievre ever made to Doug Ford 2.5 years after Poilievre became Conservative leader on March 17th. So literally 6 days before the federal election was called, and as the Tory polls were already starting to decline, that was the first time that they had ever that Poilievre had ever reached out to Ford. Ford the next day had Chrystia Freeland at his home making coffee, and then invited her as a special guest to the swearing in of his cabinet. I was actually surprised. Sabrina was mentioning the throne speech. I was actually looking out for Ms. Freeland at the throne speech, because the throne speech was in her riding. Queen's Park's in her riding, and at University of Rosedale, where I'm actually sitting now. So Freeland is my MP now, even though I don't vote in elections, but she is. Riding distribution. I used to be in Spadina, Fort York. So
gotcha.
Laura's got Karina Gould as her MP. So
okay, look, but I just want to look. This is Ontario right now. It is blank. If we go back to this is roughly. There's some changes because this is the new ridings with the old vote overlaid. But let's talk about how this can affect them. So Sabrina, I want to start with you if I can. Let's look at the Greater Toronto area. I mean, it's all red. I mean, except for Thornhill and Toronto St. Paul. But a lot of these areas on the edges of Toronto proper, that's where Doug Ford wins. And so, Sabrina, if Doug Ford and Poilievre's Conservatives are not playing nice with each other and are openly feuding, I mean, do they get the ground game? Do they get the organization to break into these areas? What do you think?
Yeah, well, I mean, initially we had heard Doug Ford sort of warning his caucus, don't go out and canvass for the federal conservatives, unless you're doing it in your spare time. And we have seen a lot of, ministers, a lot of staffers out, canvassing, door knocking, supporting the federal candidates. But, in Ontario, we tend to elect opposites, right? It's that good old Underhill theory that if we vote Conservatives in at Queen's Park, we tend to vote Liberals over on the Hill and vice versa. And so I think we could start seeing some of that dynamic at play there. But like I said, they do have some strong candidates. You mentioned Thornhill, Melissa Lanceman, Karen Sins over in Eglinton Lawrence there. But yeah, I think, at the end of the day, when Doug Ford says the truth hurts, I think he's also sort of just defending his campaign manager there. So we know there's no love lost between those two. But at the end of the day, I think, Ford was asked and he sort of took the bait there too.
Okay, so Laura, look, the GTA, that's the prize, right? If you look at seat projections where they're likely to go, the Conservatives have got to get over 70 seats in Ontario. And they're not going to do that without a 905 breakthrough. But you got Hamilton, you get down to the Niagara, you got Kitchener, you got London, you got Windsor. All of this area in southwestern Ontario, that's where Trump matters in a very profound way, like the auto sector and the manufacturing sector. If Conservatives are at war with Conservatives, what happens in this part of Ontario?
Well, look, I mean, I don't think you could discount the NDP too, right? And the way that the vote splits don't seem to be happening this time around. A weak NDP certainly would benefit the Liberals. I'm not sure how much, the personal battle between Doug Ford and Pierre Poilievre is going to matter on a riding by riding level. It may be seen as a distraction. It might be seen as unseemly by some people. If Doug Ford were out saying, vote for Pierre Poilievre, I'm stumping for Poilievre, would that make a huge difference? I'm not sure. I know, as Sabrina mentioned, there are MPs and ministers at the local level who are out canvassing for their local candidates. Stephen Lecce, a high-profile minister on Ford's government, said today he does that in his riding. Caroline Mulrooney was out endorsing him. So I'm not sure if it's more of a kind of a sideshow freak show going on, which is the battle of Poilievre versus Ford and the personal kind of vendettas that seem to be playing out in public that is mostly a distraction, or if, how strong Ford's endorsement and word would be to tip some of the scales here.
But, Benzie, I want to ask about that because Nick Kouvalis, the pollster, has been saying some stuff. Doug Ford's pollster. He does the internal polling for the Ontario PCs. He was saying some stuff on Twitter yesterday that, you know, when advance voting was happening in Ontario, the Conservatives had a big rally here in Ottawa, you know, for the ag campaign thing they did around Valentine's Day. And people were pulled off the polls for that. They were ordered not to help certain candidates in the PC Ontario thing. And they had some ridings that he pointed to where they lost by a couple of hundred votes. If the NDP vote in Ontario is collapsing and it's going red, boy, oh boy, oh boy, if you don't have the Ontario PCs helping you at full capacity, that could cost you some real key seats if you're the federal Conservatives in Ontario, could it not?
You know, it very well could. I mean, remember, the Liberals win elections by winning by small margins in lots of places in Ontario, and a lesser extent in Quebec. I think that this is the problem, and another problem that is Nick Kavaus does the most detailed political polling in Ontario of any pollster. He is in the field every single week for Premier Ford, and he also does the federal test as well. And now we know, because Premier Ford ordered the release of one of his internal polls a few weeks ago that showed the Conservatives 15 points behind the Liberals in Ontario, and in the city of Ottawa, including the riding that Mr. Poilievre is running in, it was something like 51 to 22 for the Liberals. So Mr. Poilievre, that poll suggested Mr. Poilievre could be in trouble in his own riding, and that's a really important. Though that campaign research's polling is very significant because they study Ontario more in depth than anyone else, and are in the field so often. So when that poll came out, all of us were poring over it, because it tells you where this race will be won. It looks bad for the Tories in southwestern Ontario. It looks bad for them in the 905. It looks bad for them in the city of Toronto, where, of course, it all started with them winning Don Stewart in that by-election last summer. That was the beginning of the end for Justin Trudeau. I wonder, in retrospect, David, if maybe they wish they hadn't won that by-election. Trudeau might have lived to fight another election, and then Pierre Poilievre would almost certainly be winning this election.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of stories to think about. If they blow the 25-point lead and lose this election, did they slay their dragon too early? Did they waste money carpet bombing the NDP's reputation? And why didn't they build relationships with the Ontario Conservatives and the Nova Scotia Conservatives the way they needed? All right, quick final thoughts on what you expect in Ontario in 2 weeks. Laura, your thoughts, and then Benzie, and then Sabrina.
Well, look, I think it's still a pretty close race, right? I don't think we can say today that with certainty the Liberals are going to win. It's certainly looking like, from the polls, they're up in Ontario. I think the debates are going to matter. I think missteps can still happen. But right now, on the issue of leadership, on the issue of taking on Donald Trump, Mark Carney seems to have the edge. And Mr. Poilievre is rolling out all kinds of policy announcements on the daily to do with a variety of topics, but it doesn't seem to be punching through. I think also the issue of collaboration, the way that governments work together, I think people like that. And maybe there's a sense here that, hey, look, Doug Ford could work with Mark Carney. We can keep those EV deals. We can keep the auto sector afloat. Maybe that's in people's minds when they're going to head to the polls in a couple of weeks.
Right.
But I think, for one of the first times in federal politics, we really don't know what's going to happen on April 28th.
Okay. All right. Quick thoughts, Benzie, then Sabrina, because we got to get to some other stuff.
I don't want to make a prediction, but I predict that Doug Ford thinks he knows who's going to win the election, and it ain't Pierre Poilievre. But I'm not making that prediction. I'm just saying that was the impression that I'm getting from Mr. Ford.
Yeah, that's true. The Doug Ford decision desk has a preference, that's for sure. Sabrina, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's not too late for a Hail Mary, but I think, the trump card is the wild card in all of this. Like, there's still so much uncertainty there. And, the more chaos there is south of the border, I think the more that works in Mark Carney's favor.
Okay, Laura Stone, Rob Benzie, Sabrina Nanji, always appreciate it. We'll be watching Ontario and all the other provinces and territories on election night. Thank you for being here this evening.